Hello everyone and welcome to Short Talk. Thank you for watching our last chat on the impact of COVID on environmental, social and corporate governance, or so-called ESG space. My name is Oksana Lasevskaya. I'm a partner at SL Partners, and today we continue our conversation with Evgenia Sokolova, a founder of Aktivera and former vice president at JPMorgan, about ESG. The last time we mentioned that one of the big shifts we see in the structural change in the social in ESG. So the first question which comes up into my head is why social? Evgenia, it's all to you now.
Thanks, Oksana, and it's been fun. I'm excited to be back. So let's jump right in. To me, the S is kind of like a barometer for corporate culture, if you will. It shows a lot of times how the business is run. And so on the risk management side, if there's any issues inside the company, S is often an early warning sign that provides an insight into possibly bigger issues in the company that could also be financially material issues. A quote here from Warren Buffett springs to mind, and he often says, "There's never one cockroach in the kitchen." So I guess one way to think of that is S could be that cockroach that leads you to his other buddies that are roaming around in the kitchen. And why COVID? And to link it back to our last conversation, I think COVID basically exposed more strongly either the flaws or strength the business may have as it relates to all of its stakeholders and shed more light into it.
Yeah, I like this expression about cockroaches. It comes into my mind as well that there seems to be never one cockroach in the room. So let's try to catch one. Let's go just a few examples, if we may.
Sure. Let's look at maybe how the companies have managed their supply chains. That has been under spotlight quite a bit. And one of the fairly controversial examples that springs to mind is Boohoo. I'm sure you know it's one of the fastest growing online fashion retailers in the UK. And what happened there was basically an investigation uncovered that workers were forced to come in while being sick with COVID, possibly contributing to an outbreak that was happening in Leicester. And they clearly lacked any safety protocols. If you kind of start peeling the layers of the onion, importantly, the issue there was that these workers were hugely underpaid. I mean, we're talking something like £350 an hour versus, minimum wage in the UK is what, 870-ish. And again, peel more layers of the onion and you discover some governance issues there with board composition and executive pay. And so that was an interesting example of unraveling of ESG factors and their materiality to the company.
So how material was this event, if there's any materiality on the issue?
Yeah, I guess I could look at it from three angles to gauge materiality. One is the share price, which collapsed following the investigation. And I think it wiped something like 1.5 billion of the company. Arguably, that's a temporary gauge. Secondly, its auditor, PwC, resigned because it didn't want to have any reputational association. And finally, looking at some forward-looking indicators of materiality, we learned that, for instance, other platforms that held Boohoo sales like Next and others basically dropped their clothes from their website. So that's an indicator of future sales. If you look across analyst estimates, anywhere between 10 to 20% reduction in sales next year. So I think it's fairly material, but ultimately I think the figure will come down to how the company responds to the crisis, how it manages it and communicates it, and whether the customers will buy that strategy and give it, what we call a license to operate back in its markets. And I think that still remains to be seen, to answer your question.
It's very interesting example. I can't stop thinking Would it be exactly the same case, let's say 20 years ago, or we are talking that the society has changed so dramatically during past 20 to 30 years that they have started up thinking about social impacts? What is your opinion on that?
Definitely 20 years ago, the industry has transformed quite a bit. I'm not sure even the rating of the company was, ratings were there. Could we have foreseen this earlier, before COVID or without COVID? I think that is a really interesting point, and it goes right to the heart of ESG industry challenges. So if you look on the one hand side, Boohoo was rated 71, meaning it was 71% or better than its rated universe. It was held by fairly prominent ESG asset managers. But on the other hand, if you dig deeper, we do have indices now like Fashion Transparency Index that can indicate and pinpoint specific issues. So with this particular case, it was in the transparency of its supply chain that Boohoo scored 0. So that means that basically it provided no info to where they sourced their stuff from. Add to that executive pay, there were a few earlier investigations, and there were early warning signs already there.
Wow, interesting. Thinking further, do you think that ESG ratings here to blame?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't think so. I mean, ratings are clearly, ESG ratings are far from perfect. But I tend to think of it as a kind of starting place for a fundamental company analysis. And then you basically identify the right questions to ask, and you let that drive your research and form your own view of sustainability of the company. I think at a higher level, though, you've hit the nail in the head, Oksana, because the case really highlights the fact that we don't really have a unified set of reporting standards. And what we've seen in this particular case is the firms can hide behind that. So what we really need, arguably, is one set of these reporting standards, kind of like IFRS of ESG, if you will. And I'm sure something you folks at ACCA will clearly relate to.
I like your way of thinking. Yeah, I think the issue should be actually reflected in IFRS standards, and there should be more disclosure, and it's already on its way from all perspectives. It's not sort of dramatic, but it shows really how the world is changing. If you put this aside, can we talk a little bit more about positive stories of companies engaging in social that we can learn from?
There's been plenty of bright stars through this crisis. Some examples that come to mind are, for instance, Unilever, L'Oreal, in how they dealt with their suppliers. Danone has been a lot on the spotlight. Look at that example. So interestingly, this year, Danone adopted a legal framework, what they call entreprise à mission in France, which basically incorporates ESG factors directly into the Articles of Association of Danone. And so how has it manifested through the crisis? For instance, they actually accelerated their payments to suppliers. They've created a cash reserve to help them out, provided much needed liquidity. And then for its own staff, it increased the wages again for furloughed staff, issued bonuses for manufacturing staff in France. And then one issue, again, I keep coming back to is executive pay and the difference between the top and the bottom layers of a company, and whether the senior management is really sharing the pain with its employees. And here again, Danone's senior management took a fairly sizable pay cut. I mean, we're talking 30, 40% of its pay. And what they've done is reallocate that to their employee health coverage program, which specifically was extended to include COVID coverage for both employees and their families. So that to me is a very positive signal to the industry of how, how you run your operations and treat your employees.
Wow, I can say that Danone sounds like a fantastic story to me. I think that Danone is all that good, as you say, or there could be some kind of milestones on the way.
Looking at the water business of Danone, it's clearly a big red flag. So if you look at sustainability of its sourcing, to packaging, to carbon footprint of its water operations, there's definitely a long way to go there. And again, the question I often ask myself is, how is the management dealing with it? How material is it in the future? Again, earlier this year, Danone announced a $2 billion investment program to combat specifically those issues. It will be a clear hit to the margin in the short term.
Especially I like that they have started up putting some investments in order to improve the situation with the problems that they're facing. Not so many companies would do that, especially in the times when it seems to be that financing is tight and the market is not that excellent and the perspective is quite shaky at this moment. You just, get a little bit scared and you think, okay, maybe you have to stop investment. So in this case, in this sense, I can say that Danone is doing an incredible job. So how do these measures affect the valuation of the company, if there's any possible way of measuring?
So to answer your question, basically, to me, it will come down to lower cost of capital. It demonstrates, again, that the management is thinking about it's managing its future risks today. As you mentioned, spot on, in the times of the crisis, when you're starting to prioritize financial over the ESG, Danone is actually making a strong statement saying these issues matter to us and they're at the forefront of the company. So again, to me, the biggest measure is the cost of capital for the company, but it's also goes to show that these issues like climate impacts to employee and customer resilience are becoming more and more relevant to us financially.
Interesting. I've just been listening to your stories about like positive, negative, and what is your view? Do you think that social will stay with us after COVID, or post-COVID we would go back to old normal and forget about all these social factors?
Yeah, I've been asking myself this question as well. How sustainable are a lot of these new initiatives? One specific market I've been watching is the social bonds, and I've been quite amazed to see that the issuance of social bonds this year have jumped to something like 85 billion, 8 to 10 billion last year. So an 8-fold increase in social bond issuance. And the issuance have been focused on issues like unemployment insurance, hospitals, including non-for-profit hospitals, nursing homes, affordable housing to minorities. And companies too have jumped on this bandwagon. To come back to our earlier example of management of the supply chain, Burberry's, for instance, issued a sustainability bond that aims to ensure that its sourcing of cotton is sustainable, and so improvements along that chain and employment condition in the manufacturing are also kind of enhanced. And so the reason I bring up the social bonds, because these issues are kind of incorporated and measured in the bond structure, and importantly, they are long dated. So Burberry's bond is 5 years, but we've seen companies like the Ford Foundation, for instance, issuing a $1 billion 50-year bond. So to me, that's first, that's unprecedented. And secondly, to answer your question, that kind of cements the focus on these issues for the duration of the bond. So yes, I do think this is here to stay.
Oh, excellent. To hear that, because I'm quite fond of ESG, and I hope that it will stay with us and will change our people's minds, and people would be more socially responsible, think about ecology and governance issues, because they're definitely changing us, and we have to be thinking about the future, not about just in the past. We have to think long term, not the short term. And ESG gives us this way of thinking long term and gives us sustainability in our future, like human race. So, Evgenia, thank you very much for joining in today, for sharing your views and ideas about social in ESG. It's been a very interesting conversation. And
likewise for me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Oksana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll continue our discussion next time about environmental. Am I right about that?
More than happy to.
Excellent. Thank you very much again. And thank you all for listening our Show Tech. And goodbye till next time. Thanks a lot.